one of the things that Archangel Gabriel says, he explained to me what is meant by the more you shift the way you see things, the more the things you see will shift. He explains that the act of perceiving is an active form of conscious creation. Because as we affirm that something is what it is, we create it to be.
Mm-hmm.
But when we actually see something that isn't there, then energy has to actually cause it to take form.
I'd like to welcome to the show Seph Dietlin. How are you doing today, Seph?
I'm glad to be here with you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And
I'm so
let's
glad.
let's create some amazing content for
Okay.
your audience. No, I love that.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I wanted to start with your origin story, more or less. What happened to you in 2002? Because a lot of my audience, they want to develop their own abilities. They're looking for their own connection to spirit. You were a real estate broker in
Hmm.
2002,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
it's almost trivial to say, or a little too fun to say, and you had a really bad day. And that seemed to facilitate your communication. Tell me the story of what happened to you in
Oh, it was,
2002.
yeah, no, it was better than that too. So, yes, and I guess it would seem trivial if that was all that was factored in. But there was a couple of things. First of all, I was new to real estate as of 1998. And so it doesn't matter how well you're doing. And I was doing quite well at the time. You always have to keep it going. You have to keep going on the grind. And anyone who's been successful at anything that is in the business realm knows that, you achieve a level of success, you have to keep it going. And it doesn't just stay there. You have to keep it going. And real estate means you just have to keep closing deals. You have to keep closing deals. Otherwise, the success evaporates. So you have to stay there. Now, on the backdrop of that, it was the first thing that I had done that was really that successful. So I came from a background of being bullied in school, of feeling dramatically less than uh, an acceptable human being. So I had finally gotten to the place where I felt like my life mattered to me, where I felt like I was doing something that made me feel like the real me, which is that expanded sense of self. I hadn't had that almost my whole life. I've struggled with my weight. And then to top it all off, on that particular day, and the biggest part of it wasn't the deals that fell apart that day. It was that I had found that over the course of less than a year, I was in a one-sided relationship with someone. And the relationship had eroded slowly. But when a relationship is one-sided, it feels like another form of rejection. And on the day that the real estate deals fell apart and I felt like my whole world had collapsed, this partner that I had, who also had um, a wonderful relationship with marijuana and partying, was out partying all day and was just sort of like, well, you should just give up your personal training. You should just give up your personal expenses. In the meantime, I'm supporting everything else, including the partying. And so I had come home to actually have a conversation with him about having mutuality in the relationship. And the conversation turned into a breakup. And then when it turned into a breakup, then it was like, oh my gosh, everything is out of reach. I'm unlovable. Nobody wants to be with me and create mutuality in a relationship. And the minute that I start to gain some momentum of success, it gets taken away from me. And so we get to this point where we make up these stories about ourselves. And I had a great big story made up about myself, about how unworthy I was for everything. And all of the good that had accumulated in my life, or that it seemed to accumulate in my life, it all left or evaporated in one day. And when the angels came in, they had let me know that all of that was an opportunity for me to call them in because it was an agreement that I had to work with them from then on. And oddly, what ended up happening is the real estate deals that fell apart that day all came back together a
Mm-hmm.
week later. But now I had this new journey with the angels.
Mm-hmm. But you, from what I understand, and if I'm wrong, just correct me. You literally like that night were said something to
I did.
spirit, like, I need to hear from you now, and that
I
they came
did.
through. How did
Yeah, it was just like that. Well, I grew up Catholic, so would refer to, at that point in my life, I would refer to the great creator as God. And so I said to God, you know what? I'm done. Take me out. You say that if I ask for anything, you'll give it to me. And so now I'm telling you right now, this is what I want. I'm going to go to sleep. You take me back because I don't want to be here. And I wouldn't have done anything about it to actually leave, but I actually did that. And I joke because as a real estate agent, I was making a deal with God. And I knew that after it came out of my mouth that I wasn't going to get what I wanted. So I made God a counter offer. I said, right? I said, all right, you know what? I know you're not going to give that to me. So this is what I want. I want my angels. I want a tangible relationship with the angels. I want to see them. Of course, I expected something like from the City of Angels where the window blew open and some winged beings came in. But I said, I want to see them. I want to know they're real. I want to talk to them. I want to hear from them. It does me no good to have them if I can't hear their guidance. And what's more,
Mhm.
if you look around, my life is in shambles right now. So, by the way, they're not doing a very good job. And so, right, that's what I did.
It's a
And
hard deal there, Seth. You're really pointing it into the
I
and your
love it.
people suck. They're
Yeah. But yeah, well, you keep in mind I wasn't successful at real estate for nothing. I was a pretty good negotiator back then. So, you know what? I got what I wanted too. So immediately I felt something overcome me that gave me peace. And it was beyond my own ability to choose it, and nothing had shifted externally. And I just felt peace. And I felt a knowing of something speak to me so strongly. And it just said, you know what, Seph? It's not just going to be okay. It's going to be better than okay. And I was on my bed at the time. My dog and cat jumped up and they were scanning the room. They could make out what I felt was present in the moon. And even though I didn't see winged beings, I felt the presence of some energy there. And when my dog and cat looked around, perceiving
confirmation.
whoever was in there, it was there. And it was good enough at the time because it was enough to cause me to fall asleep and go to sleep. But it was also enough so that I woke up in the morning going, wait a minute, did I imagine that? Did that really happen? Did I make that up in my head? And while I was asking the question, I felt something whiz by my ear. And then from that same thing that I had tuned in to being able to hear them speak to me through my knowing, I heard hello. And I was like, hello. And they're like, here we are. And they started to speak to me in a certain way that I would understand. And it was just sort of automatically tuned in. And of course, one of the things that they shared with me is that I would teach others how to communicate with them because unlike what I had experienced in the normal world, people don't just talk to their angels. That isn't a normal conversation. Hey, my angel told me the other day this. Of course, that's a normal conversation I have in my world now with people, but it's something that seemed inaccessible. And it does. If you haven't been inducted into that world, it is something that seems inaccessible and it's anything but.
Hmm. So for you, it went from a knowing to it was like almost a clairaudient thing. You were actually hearing, is what you're
Not
saying.
not in clairaudient, through knowing, and what I would
Okay.
call it as a telepathic communication.
Okay.
So sometimes I have to actually say to people that I'm an angel channel, but I'm more like connected to them where they can telepathically communicate to them. That could be considered a channel, but I'm communicating with them telepathically. So they're around us and they can speak to us and we can hear what they have to say for us. And the other thing is, Because of religious indoctrination, we assume that the angels are only a representation of religion. So the only reason that they would come is to make sure we get to church or temple, right? That they're mostly invested in us towing the line of the dogmatic practices of religion. And actually, one of the first things they said is, we don't have religion on the other side, and we're not here to support religion.
Mm-hmm.
Religion is a construct you have in that reality, but it doesn't exist not fully and not in the highest realms of consciousness. And that's not to dog religion, but it's actually to indicate that they are more invested in our well-being, our creativity, and our expansion as a being than they are having us live within the limitations of an earthly construct, and that we're meant to expand from out of that. They're here to help us manifest.
Yeah.
And why? People say, well, is the universe an order taker? And is it here to give you what you want? And are the angels here are they like your waiters and waitresses to help you get that? It's like, no. The journey here is about self-realization. Well, who is the self? We are the divine in a body, and manifesting is the ladder that we climb to remember who we are. We're not here to build companies. We're not here to pollute the planet. We're not here for any of that. We're here because we forgot who we are and take a journey of remembering who we are. And all the manifesting is, it doesn't matter what we manifest. It doesn't matter what we desire. It doesn't matter what comes through, if it's this thing or that thing. The ability to consciously create is actually stepping back into our true identity. And that's why the angels are invested in it, because the angels are our guides through this journey from forgetting who we are to remembering who we are. And manifesting is a key to that remembering.
How did it go for you though? So after that initial introduction, how did
Mhm.
your induction go where you got to know, you have your angels have names, like you know who they are. How did that evolve? Where did what was the next step after that first
So I became
the
aware
next
that the
meeting?
angels were speaking to me through, like, basically a voice of oneness. And I
Okay.
did call in, somehow or another, Archangel Metatron. And I didn't even realize that Archangel Metatron was a thing, but I got that name somehow. And Metatron is very pivotal to the new earth, the bringing in of the new earth, the evolvement of humanity, which is technically a step towards us remembering who we really are. But the induction of how that went is that it was kind of one of those joyful things that I was experiencing privately, and I wouldn't tell a soul what was going on.
Because you're teaching people now how to establish this connection, but you were figuring this out on your own. You had the hello.
Totally.
Yeah.
And like we say in Southern California, totally. And probably the most annoying thing that anyone outside of Southern California hears a Southern California linguist say that really bugs us. Totally. Right. So, but anyway, the this was completely me and them for quite a while. And they sent me on little missions. And unlike the way that it is today, where there's a Reiki center on every corner or a yoga studio on every corner, that did not exist then.
Mhm.
And in fact, one of the first things that happened was I asked, like, do I have energy moving through me that would help me assist other people in healing? I go, that would be great if I was a healer. And one of the steps that had happened in the process was that, well, first of all, this is kind of cool. One of the first things they did was they asked me to go to a bookstore that was nearby my house. It was walking distance. And I sort of felt that it was a mission from the angels, but I was like, well, it's just a walk to the bookstore. So there's no consequence if it doesn't turn out to be anything. Well, of course, I went there and I discovered a book. Never didn't know about the metaphysical section, and I discovered a book that was about getting signs and such from the angels, talking about feathers and coins and things like that. So I was like, oh, that was a mission from them. So I got the book and I started to read it, which sort of helped out a little bit. And then at the time, I had a post office box in Laguna Beach, California, and I would go to check my mail every other day or something like that. I was coming out of the post office and I see this white feather just materialize right in front of my face. Because now I'm watching out for feathers as signs from the angels. And this white feather materializes in front of me and it just sort of drifts off to the left. And as I look into the alley in between the post office and the parking lot, I see there's a metaphysical bookstore. I didn't know it was there. I'd been checking my mail there for like 7 years. So I go there, and in the window are all the profiles of all the different readers that were reading. And one of them worked with the angels. Not only that, but worked with the author whose book I had just picked up, maybe a few weeks earlier, right? So I thought, ooh, this is a cool sign. And of course, she only read on Tuesdays from 2 to 6, and it was like 2:25 on Tuesday. So I thought, oh my gosh, I need to go see this person. So I walk in there, and this was in the day when everything was written on a piece of paper. The woman's like, oh my gosh, perfect timing. The 2:30, her 2:30 slot just canceled, and I could see it crossed off the calendar. So I said, okay, let's do it. So I went in to see this person. And at this point, it was only between myself and the angels. And she just sort of said a little prayer. She looked around me and she said, do you have any idea how many angels there are around you? And she just sort of paused and she held up her finger like this. She said, oh, they said you don't know whether it's your imagination or not. And then she started talking about the new earth, which the angels had already started talking about and mentioning my role in the new earth. So it sort of validated. But for the most part, it was just me and them. I wasn't being taught anything. And in fact, I discovered Dolores Cannon's work a few years ago, and she's been around for ever and ever. But the minute I discovered her work, she came to me in a dream and said, I'm watching over you. And the reason that you would have never discovered this work is because you had to get it purely from the source first and then have it validated through external mechanisms.
I do want to talk about how people can develop their own connection, but
Yeah.
New Earth. Let's talk New Earth first because that sounds good. So, what do you
Yes.
have to say about it, Seph?
Well, first of all, any of us who ever pulled into a gas station and said when we were kids and asked our parents, why are we paying for this when it comes out of the ground? Right. And then questioned, why do we have those ugly power lines? Because isn't there some other form of energy? We all kind of know that there's something here. And the other thing is, when you look at the constructs that allegedly represent humanity's best interest, none of them do any of that, right? They're all criminal organizations. And I don't mean that to sound like a conspiracy theorist. You just have to look at history and see what they've done, see what the church has done, see what the government's done. And of course, we have this phony money that's not based on anything. And it's the owner of the corporations of the governments. It's like that's a conflict of interest right there, right? So when you start to see that, you understand how this ever got established and how it stands. So I didn't know anything about it, honestly. And we all don't because it's hidden in secrecy. But what's interesting is the angels, through dreams, started talking to me about this stuff. And then I started doing research to discover that it was true. It's like, oh my gosh, this is going on in the planet. Like I already sort of really figured out a lot of it when I realized why are we paying for oil and gas? Who says they own it and we don't, right? Like water, air, whatever. But then you go, interesting. So the angels immediately started saying the reason that we're coming to you is because your world is going to transition during your lifetime. And in that
Yes, we're all
transition,
living during the interesting times, aren't we? Go on,
we
Seph.
we sure are, yeah. Mm. The first thing they started to do is they took me back to the other side. And they said, see how it is here. Now you see the nature of the creator. You see the nature of creation. It lives in harmony. It's heart centered. And in this reality, there is no poverty. There is no wars. There is nobody that owns everything. And the rest of the planet has to pay them taxes for them get to have everything. And that's not the way it's meant to be there. They said, however, that was allowed as a teaching mechanism. It was allowed into the false matrix because there is an aspect of expansion for all the souls that have incarnated in the planet for all of this time. They agreed to this program because it was the maximum expansion. They said if you went there and it was just like here, you'd just sort of sit in a hammock and enjoy the beautiful grapes. But in this case, you're actually doing what it takes. You're forced to do what it takes. So, anyways, they said that all the learning was just about done, and that from there would be no more disease, because even if we've had cancer or HIV or any of these other horrible things that have been out there, we are getting to the point where we vibrate higher than the frequency of those things. There would be no reason for us to have them, because they're all teaching mechanisms. What's a
Mm.
broken foot or whatever? We wouldn't have those anymore. So they started really illustrating what the new earth was and sort of comparing it to, the other dimensions that are more in harmony with the higher frequencies. So they really called it more the coming of heaven on earth. And the new earth is a terminology that someone made up along the way that kind of sticks. But the new earth isn't really the new earth at all. It's a return to where we came from. So they usually referred to it as the coming of the new earth. And then they mentioned, that anything that stood in the way, restricted, or inhibited humanity from finding their way to the new earth, all of it would collapse. And that this collapse, according to them, would happen all on its own. They mentioned that the integrity of the structures be sort of like building a skyscraper out of wood that couldn't handle it. The integrity, the structural integrity of the constructs, especially to the magnitude of the size that they've become, that the integrity isn't there. And the integrity isn't there in the other meaning of integrity, but that's the integrity that supports the structures. There's no support, there's no structural integrity in these constructs, and that they would collapse on their own. As I started asking, how are we going to, do this? Like, you're not going to have to. You're just going to watch it happen and just continue to focus on consciousness and your connection to the source, and it will happen. Well, I've come to realize since then that as we focus on consciousness, that what happens is that we're doing these timeline upgrades. And each time we do these timeline upgrades, what happens is we're technically taking an old version offline, like rebooting a computer, and we're bringing a new version online. And so I tell the story about when I had an issue with my parking sensors, and I was going to take it in to have it repaired or looked at. And, I heard the angel say, well, don't bother, because we're going to watch how you can consciously create the solution here. Well, ultimately, I ended up helping out a friend, the long story short. And when we do all of these different things, that's when we do our little timeline reboots. And I started noticing that each time I'd reboot a timeline, that things were less and less with continuity. What do I mean by continuity? When I worked in Hollywood, for example, you'd have what's called a hot set. Maybe it's a table that's set up because they're going to go back and reshoot that same scene. Well, everything, the forks and spoons are in the right place. They're reshooting the same scene that they did before lunch. And the reason why nothing can be moved is because if you go to shoot it again and you go to stitch the scene together, you're going to watch this fork just go from here to here,
Mhm.
or, something like that. So
Yeah.
that's continuity.
Mhm.
Anyway, so when we usually do timeline reboots, we see continuity. We walk out our same yard, we see our same St. Francis statue or whatever, Buddha or whoever, and we get into our same car with the same VIN number, we're the same person with the same driver's license. Well, actually, even though we do these reboots, there's always something that's not present or that is present in these timeline reboots. So when I did a particular timeline reboot, I was helping a friend. I backed out of her driveway and the parking sensor issue just went away. And I was informed that basically what had taken place was that because I rebooted reality, in this version of reality, my car didn't have the issue. So it didn't fix my car. It brought online my same car with the same VIN number because I was in a different version of reality. This one didn't have a parking sensor issue. So
Mm.
we do this all the time. And ultimately, as we're escalating in consciousness, what we're doing is we're just in this series of timeline reboots that happen to actually bring us back to a variation of ourselves without all of these constructs. And that's how it will go away. And then we'll be back in that state, heaven on earth or the new earth.
Okay. Because I am wondering, because we are incarnate
Yep.
and we do need food, fire, water, shelter, air to maintain the incarnation. And that was my curiosity about how these, I mean, they're really massive changes that you're talking about, how they can occur without
Yes. Yeah.
disrupting the incarnation. Not that our incarnations are made to go on forever. We all know that.
Well,
So,
there's a couple of things that are part of that. So first of all, when they told me that when things started really toppling, that at that point we would have a sort of a hive mind. And I don't mean that in sort of like the Borg from Star Trek, but what I mean is that we'll be in a sense of unity consciousness with each other at the level of awareness that we'll know what to do to make it happen.
because
And
right now it seems like in any collective mind, there's a lot of fear.
well,
I
that and
don't.
so that's good that you say that because there's two different minds. There's the human mind or ego, and there's awareness. So all of us would be connected to the unity of awareness. And in the unity of awareness, there is no fear. You can't have fear and be in awareness. Fear is the block to awareness. And
Yeah.
so what I've been told is that a lot of these things just shift very easily and facilitate their own changes. And actually, we're already seeing, certain things coming online that are prepared to be ready to assist when certain other events happen. We don't have to go into that, but there is a
No,
sense,
go into it.
yeah. So, well, first of all, for example, one of the things that people are really worried about is money. And actually, if there were no people and there was no money, you could take a peer into nature. And the birds do not care what the real estate market is doing. They're just going to build a nest with the resources that they have from nature, right? And the sunflowers, they get the water from the rain, so they do not care what the real estate market is doing. They're going to still continue to photosynthesize. So there already are natural ways in which abundance is sustained in this world that would still sustain if we burnt all the money in the world and we just sort of worked with each other,
Mhm.
right?
And
So,
money's a construct. So yes,
yeah,
it is
for
optional,
example,
but it's only to the extent that we buy into it.
right.
Yeah.
So, so first of all, before there was that, we already had a system, let's say, that was heart centered or centered in the quantum field. And also, there's a lot of imagination going on. And especially, if you look at cryptocurrency, even though that's not necessarily the answer, it's already showing that humanity is already tinkering away at how we actually equalize that system first. So there may be a process first where someone who is able to allow an idea to be known by many and make obsolete the old system, everyone will just transfer into it, for example. Those are some of the scenes that I've been shown
Mm.
in that way. But I have been shown that we don't go into some sort of dystopian experience where everyone's starving to death or anything like that. There's a way that this is carried through this process that's very divinely orchestrated.
Mhm. That's lovely to hear, because as you know, there's a lot of chatter in the spiritual communities about sort of a hammer of destruction. I mean, along so many different lines,
Yeah.
like that things
Mhm.
that have to occur. So, how would
Yeah.
you suggest then that people are, plug into the right spirit here in
Yeah.
order
Yeah.
to help transition collectively, but also individually in the, most peaceful way possible.
Yeah. And first of all, let me speak to that hammer. um, because I feel like I'm supposed to, especially to give people peace of mind. And that is one of the statements that the angels have made to me along the way, reminding me that even though we're in physical bodies, that this transitional experience is a conscious one. And what happens to the constructs of the false matrix in the process is not the main event. Because too often we make it the main event about our survival needs and the money and things like that. But this is about the rise in consciousness. And from the rise of consciousness, the solutions, the way, and all of that is revealed and happens through a very beautiful flow. So I've been told that we are awake enough at the point that the hammer does come down that we're just like, oh, look at that. Okay, let's go over here and do this. And it is more of an act of freeing than it is of anything else. And so your
Mhm.
question is, how do we become in alignment with that? And the answer that I get is that we kind of already are. Anyone who's listening to your show right now, they're curious about awareness. They're already curious. 25 years ago, we weren't curious about awareness. We wanted to know when we were going to get our new car. Hopefully, we got a good interest rate. And, we didn't care about any of this, but now we do. We care that everyone is included in this, and not from the woke sense of inclusion, but from the genuine sense of really loving all and being in a state of unity, right? And we really do care about other people, and we really do see past anything that makes us different. We really do. And
I'm going to push back on you a little bit on that stuff because, yes, my audience, me, you, we care about this, but
well, yes,
so,
I agree with you that
yeah,
there is a process for bringing us all online. And I agree with you that we aren't all online yet.
yeah.
But I will say that where it hasn't expanded, it's expanded, and where it
Mm,
hasn't, it will.
okay.
Okay. So
There are,
yeah,
and I agree with you that there are more people than ever before who are concerned with
right.
these kind of matters and are open to them.
Yeah.
And I have to say, also as somebody who was raised Catholic, I do think that there's so many people in the spiritual community that are former Catholics because the one advantage that we have in our upbringings is the vocabulary we get. Like,
Hmm.
angels was an idea that was introduced to you right from the jump. So
Yeah.
even though it winds up not being the right package, it's something that people can expand into, I
Yeah.
feel. Anyway.
And I grew
Mhm.
up Catholic too. And probably like many of us who did grow up during this generation, generations before us were fully bought into everything that the church told us, which is how the church was able to control humanity for so many generations. But eventually, what actually happened is that consciousness started rising. So you go to like our generation who would go to church and the priest would say something. You're like, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense to me. You're telling me on one hand, God is unconditionally loving, and then you're telling me that he's going to put me in hell for this little tiny infraction. No, that does not sound that the two ends don't meet, right? And of
Yes.
course, if you look at what the crimes that the Catholic Church has committed throughout the ages of killing people and things like that, that doesn't sound like the way Jesus would make his mission. And we could have woke up to that and go, no, that doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah. I just want to share a story with you. When I remember being in church, I was like a tween and it was like the 80s. And
Oh.
the priest that day was giving his homily and he was going so far off the deep end about the evils of homosexuality. And this was during the AIDS crisis.
Hmm.
And, you know, just terrible stuff about people deserving to die, being punished. And there was a family, there's, if you went to mass regularly, the same one, you always knew other families, you'd see some other regulars. And there was this family, they had two boys who were a little bit younger than me and my sister. And I remember her because she had strawberry blonde hair and glasses. And she got up like during this homily that he was giving, and she was crying, and they all left the mass. And she was an AIDS nurse. So it wasn't hard for me to see who's really doing the loving thing and
Yeah,
who's not. Like that was a turning point for me, and it stuck with me. I mean, here is a woman who is ministering to these sick men who have been completely ignored and sort of pushed aside. I mean, and as you know, we probably remember in the beginning, nobody would even touch them.
I do remember.
She was a wonderful, and so that her love was such an example. So anyway, I just felt the need to say that. So
No, it's actually a perfect, authentic point of discussion because that's just one of many things. During that time that you described, I lived in West Hollywood, California, which is like the Village in New York, but in Los Angeles. And at that time, that's when Louise Hay had what was called a hayride. She actually brought gay men together who were suffering from the effects of HIV and AIDS. And this is when nobody wanted to be anywhere near someone because they thought they would catch it by being with them. But she stood in there knowing that nothing could be further from the truth. And she brought love into this space and she brought spirituality. She brought the love of God into the equation. And what you're talking about, that discussion, that's satanic if you want to look at it that way. You're talking about bringing fear and hatred into the church. That's actually the opposite of God. And we've pieced that together, right? People have asked me along the way, and I feel that they challenge me because they're triggered by the programming from religion. Are you speaking to the good team or the bad team of angels? Where on earth did you get an idea that high vibrating beings that we know exist, that are coming and talking about love and guiding us to do something that is purely loving? Where would you get the idea that that would be coming from the other side? There's a litmus to knowing whether something's connected to God or whether it is antithetical to that connection. And we feel it because our heart either feels activated or not activated. And then people will quote, well, there's a something in the Bible about how the devil can trick us and be present itself. And I say, no, that's not true. Not in that sense. That was speaking to something else. But when you are heart activated, when you're in the presence of other people who are heart activated, and when you're in the presence of people who aren't, and when you're in the presence of people who are portraying doing things for the good, but
Mhm.
you don't feel the heart activation, right?
Yeah.
And it as consciousness raises, we go, that's very interesting. I can really see what I can really see. But then generations before couldn't see it because they didn't have the access to awareness that we have now, right?
Mhm. How do you think people can, develop their own relationships with the angels? And
Just
what should
to,
they be doing? Just
yeah,
ask?
yeah. Well, that's first of all, just ask and believe,
Mhm.
just
Okay.
ask and believe. And there are
Mm.
so many resources that are available. I teach a course, for example, and when I teach the course, it's fun. The angels gave me the outline, and then when I spoke it, each of the modules, I was relaying from them. So it's really the angels teaching people how to speak to them. But I can give you a couple of the really cool tips that they gave that really do help out a lot. So the first thing again is the not so coincidentally, the topic that we just talked about, which was that litmus of energy or frequency, which is love. And the more that we focus on love, like as in the universal variety, the more that we are put in the frequency of the angels and of the divine. So in the first module, for example, of the course that I teach, the angels talk all about how we can expand into the frequency of love. And when we do, the angels become easily accessible to us through signs, synchronicity, and we get to start to hear them because of that through our knowing and through other ways. They like to use the analogy of a radio station. So for those of us that were around at the time when you had to do like this tuning of an analog gauge, the FM in FM radio stood for frequency modulation. And so a radio station came in based on the frequency that it was broadcasting at. Well, as above, so below. This is the same thing that occurs because when we're in a heightened state of frequency, then we've tuned basically the radio station into the same frequency as what comes through the divine channel. And
Mhm.
so that's one of the things. And so I give people an assignment at that point, and I ask them to make a list and just label it love. And I ask them to keep track of everything that we love, because in much the same way that we mentioned earlier, where we can see people who don't appear to be evolving and a lot of people who do, the more we look for something, the more it will expand. And believe it or not, one of the things that Archangel Gabriel says, he explained to me what is meant by the more you shift the way you see things, the more the things you see will shift. He explains that the act of perceiving is an active form of conscious creation. Because as we affirm that something is what it is, we create it to be.
Mhm.
But when we actually see something that isn't there, then energy has to actually cause it to take form. And
Yes.
that's how God the Creator creates. And we are God the Creator in a body, and we have the same power. We're bringing that back online. And the relationship that this has to the angels is that when we actually can see an experience full of interactions with the angels, it actually increases. And I have to clarify something here, and that is when we keep the love list and when we raise our frequency, we're not just changing our perception to see some more love that was already there. We're actually creating it.
Mhm.
We're actually creating more love, more energy, and more frequency in our reality by doing that. So, if you take a look at the stuff that you see happening externally, what a wonderful way to hijack people and get them focused on something that divides them. Because the minute that you just divided, whether you're right or wrong on your side of the story, you're creating division,
Yeah.
and that keeps people from becoming powerful in mass.
Mhm.
And technically, all of the false constructs of the world, their only job has ever been keep humanity from uniting, keep them from becoming a unified being. Because as long as you keep humanity from becoming a unified being, then what happens is they don't actually remember who they are and the need they do not have for the false constructs. But now that job is getting harder than ever for them. They are not a them, they are us in another body. But the job is getting harder. They're working harder to keep us divided. But that's because it's harder to keep us divided. We keep trying to move toward unity because we're evolving to become more of who we are. And the false matrix wants, and this is not a conspiracy thing, it's just part of our process of climbing the ladder of what we agreed to travel in this reality. And this is the way that this actually attempts to keep the illusion alive.
Yeah.
And so, where the angels become relevant in here is we have to remember that we're at a time in human history where maybe 20 years ago, we didn't really need this amazing relationship with them But now we really benefit from it because we're not living in the normal world anymore. We're living in a world that's highly activated spiritually to release constructs of the old matrix and replace them with new constructs. So there's a huge activation here, and that's why they're more part of our mainstream, I guess you could
Mm.
say. And so they're quite available to us.
Yeah.
Uh, Having conversations with people who are talking to them can also validate some of the things. There's a lot of times people will come into my circles and someone will say, "Oh, yeah, and then the angels did this thing." And they're like, "Oh my gosh, I had that too, but I didn't realize that was the angels guiding me."
Mhm.
So they're already talking to us.
Yeah, but I really do like what you suggested though with having a love list because it resonates too with a lot of discussions that I've had in the sense that when I talk to people about meditation or when I talk to people about manifesting, manifesting, people can focus their attention, but you need the heart energy to
Yes.
do anything.
Yeah.
And it's also, as I was asking you earlier, those antidotes for fear. I mean, you can know in your head, and this is something I struggle with. I can know in my head that I shouldn't let fearful thoughts take over. Become when I have a fearful thought, it's like I don't want to be thinking that. But of course, it's almost like I don't want to be thinking about elephants. That's not the solution to it. It's planting something else um in my heart or somebody else planting something
Yeah.
else in their heart. And I think that's a really great way. That's a really great tool you've just, suggested and given to people to actually make that list so you can turn to it and be using your head to read it and engaging your heart at the same time.
Well, let
So,
me add on to that and
mhm,
expand because this is really great. So, first of all, when I gave that exercise, and like I said, I relayed or channeled the whole entire course, and it's on audio course that I have, and so I open it up for people from time to time
mhm,
to take it, and then I have a whole community where we stay in a discussion about miracles, and it helps people expand and stay in that expansion and stay
mhm,
in that frequency. And what you said is absolutely right because frequency is key. So when I gave that assignment as guided by the angels to do the love list, every time after the first week, people come back and they say, "Oh my gosh, I'm getting so many signs from the angels and getting so many messages from them. But you know what else? I've been experiencing miracles that are off the scale. Money's coming from out of nowhere, opportunities are coming from nowhere. I'm having health things sort of resolve itself." They're like, "We're noticing like this other miracles." So it's like, so I asked the angels, I'm like, "What gives? You didn't tell me I was teaching a miracle co-creation class. You told me I was teaching an angel communication class." They're like,
mhm,
"Well, what happened to you when we came into our life, into your
mhm,
life?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, the level of miracles just went off the chart and has been there
right.
ever since then."
I'm gonna interrupt you, Seth, because I wanted to add something. There's another guy out there, I don't know if he's still alive. His name is Bill Bankston, Bengston. He had a healing method, and one of the things in his method, his book, was that at some point he said in order to do healing, you had to actually do this thing called image cycling, and he would have
Mm.
people make a list. I think there had to be at least 30 items or 20 items in a list of things you wanted to manifest. But the key to it, and it could be anything. He said it didn't have to be grand things, it could be little things, but the key about it was when you had your list, that even if you were feeling, angry, anxious, whatever, you could turn to your list because those states, because they had so much energy in them, were almost better. So you don't have to be feeling necessarily love to go to your love list. It's just taking the energy from whatever you're feeling and turning it to the frequency of love. Like that list will help you as you're talking about, it's
It
about the frequency. So
it can help some people, but
mhm,
some people it can have a reverse effect if they're in the lack of whatever that is.
mhm,
So anything that this does, so when people make the love list, what they did was they expanded so much, and that expansion is access to co-creative frequency. So I had one of the students that came in and said, "You know what? Because the list wasn't just about what you love, it's like things that you love to do." And the assignment was also when you remember something that you love to do and you haven't done it for a long time, make it a priority to go do that. And one of the students said, I remembered I used to love to watercolor when I was 5 years old. So she went and she got watercolors and everything, and she just watercolored. And you know what happens when you do art? You get in the flow. And what is the flow? It's co creation, right? So I do hypnosis with the angels in them as well. And I do this higher self activation, which is a co creation with the angels. I bring them in to the session, to a hypnosis session. And we do this higher self activation. And after people have it, again, the same thing happens where they're so charged up with love frequency that opportunities start coming and healing starts coming, because it all is about whatever we can do to achieve the frequency. And you can visualize, you can make a vision board of all the things, but if it causes you to feel the lack of what you don't have, it's not going to work, right? But if you actually start remembering, oh my gosh, I remember when I was 7 and my grandma took me to Canada and I had such a great day with her, you start feeling that. And one of the things that I learned through hypnosis is that if I start remembering the cool things that I did that made me feel an activation of my heart, guess what? That activation isn't tied to the memory. There is no time. And thus, the heart activation that occurs when we remember something that brought us into that heart activated state, the heart activation is in real time. And it is something that's happening now, even though we trigger it from a memory. And so that's the point of this, is actually feeling that love. We already know that if we get into an argument with someone that we really love, and then all of a sudden we get out of our head and we go into our heart and we're like, oh my God, I love that person so much. And then pretty soon, everything that we're arguing about doesn't matter anymore, just as long as we're experiencing love.
Mhm.
And so what's interesting is when I do these activations, I'm always told by the angels to point out to the person when they're in that highly attuned state. I say to them, now, if a powerless thought were to come into your knowing, would it have any power over you? They're like, no, because we can't be in our heart and occupied in expansion and accept a powerless thought. We literally can't. We're like, no, do not take me out of this state. And that does not matter. And
Mhm.
so, it's the feeling, and we're taught not to feel, but the feeling is where it's all at.
Well, we're taught to not trust our feelings, that your
Right.
head is more important than your feelings. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and,
Hmm.
and and nothing keeps the false matrix intact more than that edict that came down from the false matrix, because it came from a lot of places that would really rather keep its power, and not that it's a separate being from us. I just always have to add that, because the minute we remove from being in that discussion as an us versus them, then we start to have power over it.
Hmm. Yeah, I see.
Yeah. If it's an us versus them conversation, then it's a powerless conversation. It's not the power to consciously create change or create expansion. But if it's a, wow, that's me in another body creating something which is an opportunity for expansion, then we get the expansion as opposed to the suppression that we usually take out of it.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to move to what I call my lightning round of questions, which are the questions I ask all my guests, if you're game.
I'm game.
Okay. So, first one is, what does a well-lived life look like to you? In any incarnation you want to pick.
Yeah. Being in a state of joy that constantly propels more joy.
That's lovely. What do you suspect is the true nature of reality? And it's not even suspect. I think you have a pretty good idea.
An opportunity to remember the power that we have.
Interesting. Very interesting. How do you think how can people or should people engage with their consciousness or soul?
Realize that you already have it and you're already using it. And the minute you realize how you're using it, it will expand for you.
Okay. This isn't one of my questions, but I did want to ask you about the nature of time. We really didn't discuss time, but I think you
Yeah.
have something to say about that. What do you think of time?
Well, it is an artificial construct as well. Just because we experience it doesn't make it real. And we already know because it can fluctuate. It's not an absolute. You're waiting in the dentist's waiting room. 5 minutes seems like 3 hours. You go on vacation to a fantastic destination. 3 weeks seems like 5 minutes. So we already know that it's not an absolute just because it's measured by a device on our wrists or whatever. Okay. But timelessness is connected to heightened state of awareness. So when we go into awareness, we experience the timeless state, which is the real state. And time only exists while we're in a certain frequency, but it serves as a teaching mechanism until we don't need it anymore.
Have you had experiences outside of time?
Hmm. Some really juicy ones. Yes.
Oh, well, come on. Now you have to tell me at least
Yeah.
one.
I will tell you one.
Okay.
There was a time that I actually had to leave my house to be at an appointment when I was still in real estate. And I had to be there. It usually took 15 minutes from my house to the office, and I left at 10:20. I had a 10:30 client. I decided not to look at the clock, realizing that time is a false construct. And I thought, well, maybe the client will be late and it'll be okay. But I decided to have a peaceful state of being, which put me in a timeless state. And so I left my house at 10:20. The drive is 15 minutes. And I showed up in the parking lot and I arrived at 10:27. So it took me half the time to actually travel, or time got suspended while I was traveling. And of course, I asked them, like, wow, if we can do this, can we do this more often? They're like, don't get greedy. You got all you needed was the 8 minutes. You didn't need hours. But it was the whole idea of realizing that time wasn't real, because there's no other way that it wouldn't have taken me less than 15 minutes. Um, because I still got the red lights where I got the red lights. There was nothing that changed except I didn't keep track of it. And the same thing happens when we're patient with stuff. Oddly, when we're patient, we don't affirm the density of the false construct of time. And that's why things start moving when we're patient. Patience is more than a virtue, it actually facilitates momentum. So there's many times that I've had something like that. And when you need it, and you got to remember, you're always going to get what you need, nothing more. It'll happen with money too. Like money will come in. Sometimes money will come in when you need it, but it's just enough. And they're like, well, why didn't you send more? It's like, don't get greedy. You got what you needed magically. It doesn't matter. Right. So hopefully you enjoy that.
Yeah, that one I needed to hear. And also patience. Patience has always been my
Yeah.
my thing, and you've just given me another reason why I need to develop that more.
Well, it's a good thing you moved out of Manhattan, right? Because
Yeah.
there's that impatient thing is socked into the collective there in Manhattan too.
Yeah,
So
yes, it is. And I have, as I said, things have changed. And when I moved there, I think my energy was a much better match for the city than it is now. So,
yeah.
okay, yeah. When you die, this incarnation, what do you hope to find or discover?
Mm. I hope to discover the purpose for having been this particular being or
Mm,
experienced being this particular being.
yeah, I'm kind of I want to know things.
Yeah.
Yes. And where can people find you and the good work you're doing?
Talk to myangels.com. That's talk and then TO, myangels.com. I give more of myself to the community that I created than I do to social media, because those are people that can actually use it as opposed to just moving on to the next video. So
Yeah.
I have created a community and people can reach out to me and become part of that community as well.
Okay. And do you have any final thoughts for the listening audience?
Yeah. I really want anyone listening to know that no matter what it looks like in the external world, things are being activated for your greatest and highest path. And it's a reminder that you wouldn't have been awakened to your true nature just to end up in a reality that is the opposite of what you have the potential to create. Just remember that you have the power to create the reality you want to live in. And you wouldn't have been awakened to that if you couldn't actually utilize it. And anything that looks daunting in our reality, anything that looks like a disappointment, anything that looks like a setback is absolutely not. It is a trigger for accessing more of that power. So don't be in that powerless part of seeing yourself or humanity as a victim to something that it's not. See it as an opportunity to tap into that greater power and use it for the greater good.
That is both beautiful and comforting.
Eh,
So, on that note, thank you, Seth, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Click to join us on another journey, and don't forget to subscribe.